Welcome to the Consulting Leaders Podcast, where we talk about the business of consulting. Whether you're looking to grow your practice or learn from the stories of leaders in consulting, you're in the right place. I'm your host, Guillaume Jouvencel, ex-PwC and co-founder of GHA Marketing. Join me as I interview the best consultants in their niche. Let's get on with the show. Jez, welcome to Consulting Leaders. Happy to have you.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me.
Let's jump straight into it. So, what pulled you into the very interesting world of behavioral science, and how did that transition into becoming a consultant?
Yeah, so my early career, the first 25 years, the first 20 years of that were predominantly working in advertising and marketing. And we've been doing a lot of work in persuasion and influence, and psychology and psychological concepts were there. They just weren't as academic or as explicit. I kind of found that kind of quite intriguing. And then, around about 15 years ago, 17 actually, Nudge, the book, broke the behavioral economics market. You know, it had been something that had been going on for 2 decades, 3 decades before that. But I think that was a pivotal moment. And that was the opportunity for me to deepen my scientific understanding of what makes people, what drives people, and how you get people to change their behavior. And kind of my overarching insight was that the academic community is amazing, but sometimes less amazing at sharing these insights in accessible ways that people can then act upon. And I'm less of an academic and definitely more applied. So I saw there's a big opportunity to take these amazing insights and translate them into real world practical tools and strategies. So that was the moment.
I love that. And so what's from the transition to now the biggest problem that you're solving? Like, what is it that you're helping your clients with?
Yeah, it's kind of very counterintuitive at this point, because it challenges the way that we ourselves often perceive our behavior is driven. That our kind of like mental model is that our brains tell our bodies what to do. So we have this kind of like the mind dictates and the mind designs, and the kind of the framework, if you like, for how that exhibited within advertising was, you know, if we drive kind of awareness of a particular concept, you know, so that might be a brand, or it might be a particular behavior, or it might be a particular action, then we can essentially seed some interest in that, drive some desire, and then ultimately action will follow. So our attitudes, if you like, will formulate within our mental kind of availability, and then we'll act upon those kind of themes. So attitude would drive into behavior. And I think what I found was that around about 20 or 30% of people who hold an attitude do translate into behavior. But there's a lot of people, 70% plus, that hold an attitude potentially, but don't actually exhibit the behavior. So, you know, classic examples would be based around sustainability, would be around health, and be around finance, that people all want to save for the future. They all want to be healthy. But it's just quite difficult, I think, for people to do that. And especially if the goals are quite big. I mean, your personal finance and your personal health are quite close to you. But if it's the climate, it's this kind of very meta concept. It's quite difficult. So observing those kind of 3 key sectors was like, actually, I think there's some really interesting work to be done here. So working predominantly in the private sector, helping organizations that were focused on those kind of 3 things, health and finance and climate, have been kind of a key part of the last 15 years for me.
Okay, we're going to take a little bit of a tangent here, but I think that's going to be super interesting for the B2B coaches and consultants listening to us. Why is that when we say, hey, this is our goal, and when asked, okay, what are you going to change to achieve your goal? Because clearly what you've been doing so far hasn't helped you reach that. Why is it that we struggle so much to initiate change? Because once we take the first step, then it's like a cycle of learning, mistaking, iterating, doing it. I talk to so many B2B coaches and consultants for whom the goal of 2026 is scale, growth. And when presented with a solution that is validated, that's going to help them do, it's like, it's so hard for them to take the next step. Why is that?
Yeah, I mean, the interesting kind of phenomena, which is wrong. So Professor Kahneman and Amos Tversky have said that, certainly within Kahneman's work more latterly, is that we have kind of two brains in our brains. You know, one is this very reptilian, quite ancient brain, which thinks incredibly fast. And then we have this very deliberative, slow brain. And I think we often confuse which parts of our brain we're using to make what type of decisions, and don't understand that. So I don't think anybody on this podcast won't have heard of Thinking Fast and Slow. A lot of people would have read it, be familiar with System 1 and System 2 as concepts. But actually understanding and developing tools and skills that allow you to embrace both those parts of decision making are really, really important. And so, you know, a classic thing would be, you know, kind of a social norm is a really powerful thing within organizations and teams. And, you know, if one person out of 8 says, I think we should do this to scale our business or our client's business in 2026, and nobody else agrees, then it's pretty hard. But once you start to get 3 or 4 or get over that sort of a Rubicon of 5 out of 8, then all of a sudden you've got a normative approach to decision making. And that's not wrong. You know, you would hope that people individually have thought rationally and slowly and deliberatively about that decision, but actually coming together as a group and seeing consensus and seeing majority is a really powerful force. So often combining deliberative thinking with kind of more automatic and more kind of system 1 sort of shortcuts and biases is a really, really important way of making decisions. And so I think thinking about a combination of these two is really important. And I think the kind of misunderstanding of Kahneman's work that I kind of have found chatting to people is that people get so enthralled and embrace kind of this Homer Simpson system 1 brain that makes automatic quick decisions. And 90 to 95% of decisions originate there as a hypothesis, that they become overwhelmed with thinking that that's all that matters. And it's just not true. Is that the best way to make decisions is to have 2 parts of your brain interacting with each other, such you get an integrated and balanced decision. And I really like that. I really like emotions. I'm quite an emotional person. Those people around me will say so. And as I've got older, I've learned to not control my emotions, but balance my emotions. So have that initial emotional reaction and response, which is gut or brain. But then think about it. Think about it overnight. Think about it from a different context. Think about the risks, and then come together after a period of reflection. And if the emotions still ride through, then go with the emotion. You know, that's the overriding force. But actually, if the emotion was transient and fleeting, then maybe, yeah, in the cold light of day, the next day, or chatting to other people who've got different points of view, you come to a more balanced decision. So that's what I would do, and that's what I practiced, which is believing in emotions and the power of emotion, but balancing them with cold light of day and rationality and more consensus team thinking.
It sounds simple when you say it. I think to implement is not easy, because the number one emotion when it comes to change is fear. That's literally fear of change, and we are programmed to, break from. I don't know how to translate this French expression into English, but to stop everything from the subject of our fear to happen.
Yeah,
that's interesting.
Yeah, I mean the psychological phenomena or principle would be loss aversion. That, you know,
Right.
for us just to survive and thrive, you know, the cadence and valence of loss, it looms larger than the gain, and that's kept us alive. You know, that we're optimistic as human beings for sure, but we take fairly kind of sort of emotionally system one calculated risks. I think that is quite interesting. That, I mean, as an entrepreneur, I found it really, really quite difficult sometimes, because people often think entrepreneurial people are, risk takers, high on extrovert, gregarious, want to be seen, quite narcissistic. And actually, I've certainly found the opposite of that, I don't exhibit a lot of those types of kind of behaviors and kind of outwardly projecting kind of themes. And yeah, I think I do feel fear and nervousness about some of the decisions that I'm going to make. But by talking to other people and judging their responses about some of your ideas is a really, really good way. So, I know that my decision in isolation is going to be average to poor, but in combination with 3 or 4 other people I know and trust, or maybe people that I don't know and don't yet trust, is really an interesting way to see if this is going to be something. So I think market testing, not necessarily like quantitative surveys, but talking to people about your ideas in kind of a high level way, is a really, really good way, I think, to get immediate feedback, especially when you're working in teams. So, hey, for 2026, I think we should be taking our business in this direction because of these 3 reasons. What do you guys think? And not trying to sell in your idea, but really listening to the feedback and listening to the speed of the feedback and listening to the emotions that come back with the feedback. If someone says, I totally agree with you, that's an amazing idea, then clearly they haven't thought about it that long and they're doing it to please you. Interestingly, when some people say, that's really interesting, I like point 1, but I don't think there's enough evidence point 2 and 3, but let's have a reflection and come back to you tomorrow. And that I think is good. So yes, I think combining the learnings of some of the literature, but practically applying them in usable ways in a day-to-day environment, albeit done in a less than empirical way, is a really, really easy and quick way to test these things.
So who do you help today, Jez, with solving that specific problem? Like, who's your ICP?
Yeah, I mean, I talked a little bit about them sort of previously. I've spent the last 10 years at Cowry with the team, really focusing a lot of our work on future finance. The cost of living crisis is kind of always seems to be there, certainly for the last 4 or 5 years. But providing enough money for financial future and provision for a comfortable or moderately comfortable life was something that I really cared about. If we could use behavioural science to help people offset and overcome some of these kind of challenges that our brains put in the way of us, then that'd be a good thing. So yeah, so pension companies, insurance companies, some of the wealth management companies, just helping people make some of those steps. So Guillaume, you talked about those first steps. I think from my understanding, most people are going to be in debt considerably from the age of 20 to maybe like 50, because no one can afford to buy a house outright when they're 20. It's difficult just to start in most kind of European places right now. We know that. And but just sort of having a mental kind of mindset to go, I'm in debt, and that's something that I'm going to manage, and everybody's broadly in that situation. But in tandem with that, I'm going to be a saver. I'm going to save some money, not a lot, because I can't, because it's really hard to live, and I'm going to have some money invested, not a lot, but enough to invest. And just making those mental shifts to go, I am in debt, I'm going to have a discretionary amount of money for today, I'm going to have some money which I'm saving for the near future and some money for the long-term future. That mindset is really, really important, as opposed to the one which is I can't afford to save and I can't afford to invest, in which case you'll never mentally position yourself as a saver investor. So having that kind of micro commitment and that sort of first step which is relatively easy. Opening accounts and starting that process is really, really important. And of course, you know, as you get older, as you work harder, you acquire things, and these things start to change. So you become less in debt, have more savings, and have more investments. And you know, one of the things that, you know, people don't understand, our brains don't really compute, is that compounding of value in savings and investments. And yeah, I mean, it's, you know, I didn't start saving for my pension broadly till about 29. In the UK, with the companies that I was working with, we couldn't actually start a pension till we were 30. That was company kind of contributed. And I think, you know, it wasn't the fault of that company. They were a brilliant company, but that's the wrong mental frame. And so I think that has been really, really important, which was demystifying sort of money for now, money for later, and money for the future. And, you know, the psychology that sits behind that. So did a lot of work in that, a lot of work in retail. So I think there's still, you know, there's kind of a continuum of organizations that make it really, really easy to buy, Amazon et al., to other organizations that make it really, really complicated to buy, sometimes for their own dark reasons. But making retail kind of fairly frictionless but meaningful is really important. So you don't want people to buy things frivolously and waste money. But you do want them to consider what they're purchasing, but make the purchase experience quite frictionless once they've made that decision. And then the other one is utilities, you know, and that's with cost of living becoming more and more and more important, is, you know, the gas and electricity markets and how they're evolving with newer forms of energy, and the different tariffs. It's just so confusing, you know, and, you know, I just find it difficult sometimes not to believe that the asymmetry of knowledge and understanding is kind of with the companies. And I don't personally think that the infrastructure is making it easy for people to understand energy, how to buy it, how to use it. Yeah, it's kind of that's a big challenge, I think. So, you know, a standing charge, a kilowatt hour charge for different times of day, for different types of usage, different kilowatt charges for different types of energy like gas and electricity, different types of standing charges, you know, fixed amount of money, variable amounts of money, capped amounts of spend. It's just really, really complicated. Yeah, I think there's a lot of work to be done in that market, just so people understand. I mean, you know, this is most probably wrong for those people that are experts, but solar panels on houses, you know, is becoming kind of a really interesting kind of investment, if you like. But I was doing some research, and from what I gathered, it was about a 10-year payback. So, you know, I mean, that's quite an easy thing to understand. It's, you know, if you're going to get solar panels, you know, you're going to see the value in your house payback in about 10 years time. You know, and that's assuming there's no kind of incremental value from the solar panels on the house. But like utilizing language and frames that people understand is really, really important. And, you know, saying things like electric cars on average cost about a third of the cost as petrol cars per mile to run, is a really interesting thing to understand, but no one says that. You know, you've got to get an electric car, you've got to run an electric car, you've got to charge it overnight, you've got to then work out what your average tank and mileage might be and compare the two. But and people just don't say it. I mean, it's a no-brainer. It's like, you know, if you can afford to lease or buy an electric car, it's a third of the petrol cost. So work out the petrol cost on a monthly basis, times it by 12, then times it by a third, and then work out that saving. And if it's worth you buying an electric car and investing in it over a number of years, it's not hard. It's just the way that these markets are set up, I think, is not easy. So that's what I've dedicated my life to, those 2 or 3 things.
I like it. So the way I hear you talk about it, there is a huge education gap in the market. So what has worked for you and, you know, your consulting group of behavioral scientists to educate the markets, clearly state the problem, make people problem aware, solution aware, and come to you? Basically, what has been the marketing mix that has worked for you, Jez, so that you get your ICP educated but also to come to you for solutions?
Yeah, I mean, it took us a while because we used a behavioral science technique subconsciously without really being aware that we kind of, and I was kind of part of it, was we kind of followed what everybody else was doing. That we had a lot of behavioral science people talking in sort of events and conferences, behavioral science conferences. And I or others maybe weren't doing the due diligence, but essentially we were just talking to each other, which wasn't wrong. But there were no potential prospects, or there was no potential scaling effect, because we were just educating each other on the work that we were doing, which is good, right? But when we set up Cowry, it became my livelihood. It needed to work for me and our team and our investors. So you just think harder. And so we made a decision that we were going to go into a different space and invest significant amounts of funds into kind of vertical market conferences around kind of customer insight and customer experience, customer understanding. We're predominantly a private sector consultancy. We do some civic work. And so we went to those audiences and we went to smaller events. So it wasn't the big sort of CES and those big expos. It was kind of 30, 50 people, a joint sort of combined interest, a curiosity around a particular topic. So it might be about patient centricity in pharmaceutical, and how customer centricity could start to evolve patient centricity. Or it might be around kind of like different ways of eliciting insight around behaviors with certain customer groups. And what we found was that when we went there, it was clients and clients talking to clients, sharing kind of insights and some of the work they were doing, coupled with technology companies, usually selling a platform. So we were the only kind of company there that were talking about what we were talking about. And so we really stood out. We deliberately designed our kind of expo and stand in a way which was different. So, we always led with insight and case study. So there was no selling or merchandising material. It was more about, which is, what we fundamentally believe in. It's like, isn't this fascinating? Like, people think this, but they don't do this. But if you get them to do this, they do that. And if you can do that in an interesting way within your organization, everybody wins. And the benefit to the business is significant, and the ROI is significant, and it's statistically significant, and it's scalable. So after that kind of expo, if you like, in lots and lots of different, like other pensions industry, insurance, retail banking, or retail, or utilities, or pharmaceuticals, what you find is a lot of people are really interested and curious about the work you've done. So we started doing that 10 years ago. And I think we've kind of saturated some of the events that we've been at, for sure. You get regular appearances from certain clients and organizations, and we've been doing it for a decade. And but it's definitely worked and continues to work, which is sort of sharing the love of behavioral science in an interesting way and allowing the work itself and the behavior change itself to sell itself, and then getting people interested through that door. So quite different from a sales technology platform with salespeople in polo shirts trying to sell a demo. It's a very different approach.
So conferences, very narrow niche groups of people that you can have an educated conversation with, basically very targeted, precise ways of communicating your business. Is that?
I think having the sort of we don't have a partner structure within Cowry, but having the CEO, the MD, the leads, having the people that can have that commercial conversation about how this relates to business, as well as the behavioral science, is really, really important. I mean, one of the things that I've said for a long time, and I'll start saying more publicly, that I think for a long time behavioral scientists themselves were holding the discipline of behavioral science back because they were so fascinated by the science. They became sort of quasi-academic. It was less about the impact and the outcomes. It was more about the process and the methodologies and kind of like the rigor, and those are all important. But ultimately, when you're dealing with people in private enterprise, they're looking for outcomes. It's either doing things the same but doing them better or quicker, or doing new things and acquiring new customers or saving existing ones. And so having people that can kind of like bridge that is really, really important. And yeah, we developed what we call world-class behavioral science consultants. We felt there was a lot of behavioral science consultancies that weren't really consultancies; they were a practice, and we spent a lot of time making sure that we trained either behavioral scientists to become better consultants, or started to hire consultants to make them better behavioral scientists. So, one of the real kind of like accolades that we've had is to attract people from the likes of EY, PwC, Accenture. For a smaller consultancy to be able to attract talent like that, it is pretty phenomenal. And yeah, it's definitely built our brand. But yeah, I think having people that can bridge academia applied to real world business has really been a key part of what we do.
What's your biggest challenge, though, Jez?
Yeah, I mean, there's a few. I mean, I think I was on a podcast about 4 or 5 years ago. It's called The Growing Pains of Behavioral Science. And I was asked this question then, and I'll give the same answer. But 5 years ago, I was given a very, very different answer to everybody else on the podcast, because everyone was saying things like not being able to identify the key stakeholder, not being able to identify a budget pot, and not having the capability or the resources to scale. Behavioral science was a relatively small field then. My reflection at the time was that so much money even then was being spent in predictive analytics, ML, and early forms of AI, that the investment, like the key investments that are being made within private enterprise, were into AI. So I said, AI, is the biggest challenge, and I think now, when we're thinking about behavioral science, that kind of it had its moment where it was kind of a curiosity in the boardroom, but that moment has gone now, and the questions that we're beginning to answer are: artificial intelligence clearly isn't enough. How can we combine that with behavioral science to create more human, yet kind of intelligent interactions? So we've been driving on a theme of behavioral intelligence, which is bringing together these two worlds of profound insight of behavioral science with the kind of like the unparalleled power of AI data and technology. So we started to see that in some of the bigger platforms, that psychology is starting to become a discipline and a tool. It's too small at the moment. I think a lot of engineers believe that a neural network and understanding how to code that means that you understand behavior, and it's just not true. So yeah, I think there is definitely some harmony and some shared DNA, but I think you need to have two people coming together that have got this kind of combined understanding. And BSci AI, or behavioral intelligence, is starting to really build momentum, because as we know, either the adoption of AI is kind of slow or flawed, and the use of it isn't anywhere near as kind of as common or widespread as it should be. But actually, the models themselves, in the past, have exhibited some of these sort of coded kind of model flaws from how the data's been sort of fed in, and there is kind of an interesting phenomena. Again, this is that our discipline has spent a lot of time thinking about human psychology and how that manifests itself, and the idiosyncrasies of that. There's a very nascent kind of group of psychologists that are looking at machine psychology, which is looking at the psychology of AI and seeing if there are any new kind of phenomena that aren't exhibited by humans that are exhibited by AI. And that's different from an hallucination. So that might be, we've defined very clearly, Kahneman and others have defined this principle of loss aversion, and done that empirically. And it differs by context, differs by culture, but it is a real thing. Is there something else, and a phenomena that only AI exhibits that humans don't, which is more about their psychology? And that is fascinating. So another discipline of psychology, or another kind of arm of psychology, is kind of starting to appear, which is great.
Jez Groom, ladies and gentlemen. Jez, if people want to find out more about you, see what you do, where should they go?
Yeah, so my personal website is thebehavioural So I've had that for a long time. Obviously, the discipline now is called behavioural science, but in the early days was the behavioural economics. So thebehavioural You can find out more about me there. LinkedIn, obviously, connect with me there, and the Cowry website. So there's a module on the Cowry website which says book some time with me, and I will be there. So I'm very, very open and accessible, and I just want to democratize behavioral science. This has been a passion of mine and continues to be. So I will always find the time if people want to talk about behavioral science.
We'll put all the links in the description. I can say one thing for sure, Jez, is that you've got at least one new connection on LinkedIn out of this interview. Me, I just added you. Jez, thank you so much for coming on Consulting Leaders.
Thank you very, very much. Really enjoyable.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of the Consulting Leaders podcast. We hope you learned valuable lessons on how to grow your practice and take your business to the next level. Make sure to subscribe and leave us a review wherever you're listening to this show so you never miss an episode. To apply and be a guest on the show, click the link in the description. See you next time. How was that